On the morning of April 13th, 1953, a pen moved across a page in a government building in Washington, D.C. The signature it left was unhurried. Outside the window, the Capitol was doing what it always did on a mid-April morning, the light coming in low and pale, the Potomac somewhere beyond the buildings, the ordinary sounds of a city at work rising from the streets below. Inside the room, the man holding the pen was Allen Dulles, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the document in front of him was classified, its language dense and administrative, its implications visible only to the small number of people who had drafted it and the smaller number who would ever read it. He signed it. The pen lifted. The morning continued. What that signature authorized would not be known to the American public for more than 2 decades. The program it brought into formal existence operated for the better part of 20 years across dozens of institutions, channeled millions of dollars through networks of carefully constructed financial intermediaries, and produced records that were later deliberately destroyed. That all of this grew from a single signed page on an otherwise ordinary April morning is one of the more remarkable administrative facts of the Cold War era. Not remarkable in a theatrical sense. Nothing about the signing itself was theatrical. Remarkable in the way that a small door, quietly opened, can give on to a very large room. The memorandum Dulles signed that morning authorized a program called MKUltra. The designation itself meant very little on its face. MK was a prefix used by the CIA's technical services staff for certain categories of covert activity, and Ultra was simply the word that followed it. Filed alongside other technical services designations, the name would have read as nothing more than an internal organizational label, bureaucratic shorthand of the kind that filled government filing systems by the thousands. What it designated was something considerably less ordinary, a formally sanctioned program of research into the control of human behavior, funded covertly, conducted across a network of universities and hospitals and other institutions, and structured from the beginning in ways that were designed to prevent any outside audit from tracing its funding back to the agency that was paying for it. The authorization Dulles signed that morning deliberately bypassed the normal oversight mechanisms that governed most CIA programs. This was not an accident of paperwork. The program was given unusual operational latitude within the technical services staff, with accountability structures that ran through very few channels and reporting requirements that were by design minimal. The men who built MKUltra into its eventual structure understood that what they were proposing to do would not survive ordinary institutional scrutiny. The way the program was authorized reflected that understanding precisely. To understand why the document existed at all, it helps to sit with the specific mood of the American intelligence community in the years just before Dulles signed it. The early 1950s were years of a particular kind of institutional anxiety, not the loud public anxiety of wartime mobilization, but something quieter and in some ways harder to address. The United States was the most powerful nation in the world by most conventional measures. It had emerged from the Second World War with its industrial base intact, its territory unoccupied, its scientific establishment swollen with talent drawn from across the globe. And yet there was something the intelligence community felt it did not understand, and the not understanding of it had taken on an urgency that the documents of the period returned to again and again. The Korean War had been producing something troubling. American prisoners of war, filmed in the camps where they were held, had been appearing in newsreel footage reading statements. The statements were pro-communist in content. The men reading them were American soldiers, and they read with the kind of steadiness that made the footage difficult to dismiss as simple coercion. These were not men who appeared to be reading at gunpoint, or at least not obviously so. They appeared in some cases to be doing something that looked from the outside like agreement. The footage was replayed in briefing rooms across Washington. Intelligence analysts studied it. The question that came back again and again was what had been done to these men. A grainy image on a screen in a darkened briefing room is not a complete account of anything. The footage of American POWs making statements before cameras in Korea was capable of multiple interpretations, and the men who studied it were working in conditions of limited information and considerable institutional pressure. What they landed on, in the absence of a better explanation, was a cluster of possibilities that shared a common feature: the idea that the enemy had developed some method of altering human thought and behavior that American science had not yet identified. Whether that method was pharmacological, some compound slipped into food or water, or psychological, some system of pressures and deprivations applied over time, or some combination of both, the intelligence community could not say with confidence. What it could say was that the footage existed, that it needed an explanation, and that the explanation it feared most was that the United States was technologically behind, in a domain that no one had previously thought to treat as a domain at all. The word that entered American public vocabulary during this period, largely through the reporting of a journalist named Edward Hunter, was one that carried an enormous amount of this anxiety in a very compact form. Hunter published a book in 1951 whose subject was the treatment of prisoners in Korean War captivity, and whose title introduced a compound that American readers had not previously encountered in print. The word was brainwashing. Hunter drew it from a Chinese expression, shi nao, meaning literally the washing of the brain, and used it to describe what he argued was a systematic process by which communist authorities could alter the beliefs and behaviors of captive subjects through psychological manipulation. The word spread quickly. It appeared in newspaper editorials, in congressional testimony, in the internal correspondence of intelligence agencies. It gave a name to the fear that the footage of American POWs had generated, and in giving it a name, it made the fear available for institutional use. A word that circulates publicly and a word that circulates within a government agency are not always the same word, doing the same work. In the popular press, brainwashing operated as a kind of dramatic shorthand, a suggestion that the enemy had access to methods of human control that bordered on the supernatural, methods that could make a free man speak as though he were not free. Within the CIA, the word was taken somewhat more seriously and somewhat less literally. The analysts who worked with it were not convinced that communist authorities had developed some science fiction method of wholesale mental transformation. What they were concerned about was more specific, and in some ways more tractable: the possibility that particular drugs or particular sequences of psychological stress, or some combination of the two, could make a person more susceptible to suggestion, more willing to answer questions, more likely to adopt beliefs or perform actions that they would not otherwise choose. This was not magic. It was chemistry and psychology, and chemistry and psychology were things that an intelligence agency with sufficient resources could in theory study systematically. The CIA had in fact already begun that study before Dulles signed the MKUltra authorization. The program that preceded MKUltra was called Project Bluebird, and it had been established in 1950 as the agency's first formal attempt at what internal documents described as behavior control research. Bluebird was reorganized in 1951 and given a new designation, Project Artichoke. The name changes were administrative rather than substantive, Artichoke inherited Bluebird's personnel, its ongoing contractor relationships, and its research agenda, which had already begun to encompass the use of drugs, hypnosis, and psychological techniques in interrogation scenarios. By 1953, Artichoke was itself absorbed into the larger structure of MKUltra, which folded in everything that had come before and extended it considerably. The filing cabinet that held the folders marked Bluebird and Artichoke eventually held folders marked with sub-project numbers in the dozens, and then in the hundreds. The names gave no indication of what the folders contained. There is something worth noting about the word artichoke as a name for a government program. It is the kind of name that is chosen precisely because it means nothing, an arbitrary label that carries no semantic content related to the activities it designates, that sounds unremarkable when spoken in a hallway, that would not catch anyone's attention if overheard. Bluebird is similar. These are not code names designed to evoke the character of the programs they cover. They are anti-code names, names whose purpose is to not evoke anything at all. The arbitrariness was deliberate. Filing cabinets full of folders with names like these would look to someone unfamiliar with the programs like the ordinary organizational apparatus of any large institution, which was, of course, exactly the impression they were meant to give. The budget that supported MKUltra over the course of its full operational lifespan has been estimated by congressional investigators working from the financial records that survived later document destruction at approximately $10 million in the currency of the period. That figure, expressed in terms of what the same purchasing power would represent today, is considerably larger. Some estimates place the equivalent value at several times that amount in contemporary terms. But the raw figure, even in period currency, represents a substantial institutional commitment. $10 million, distributed across 20 years, channeled through a network of front organizations, and passed through foundations designed specifically to prevent any single audit trail from identifying the CIA as the source, represents a logistical achievement of some complexity. The people who built that financial architecture were not doing casual work. They were constructing something intended to be permanent, to be invisible, and to function at scale. The mechanism by which the money moved was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than funding universities and hospitals directly, which would have created a documented relationship between the CIA and the receiving institution, the agency established or co-opted a set of organizations that appeared to be independent philanthropic foundations. These foundations had names that sounded like the names of legitimate philanthropic organizations, respectable, vaguely humanistic, the kind of names that appeared on grant letters in university correspondence files without attracting comment. A department chair who received a letter from one of these foundations offering research funding for a project in psychology or psychiatry or pharmacology had no particular reason to investigate the letter's origin more deeply than the letterhead suggested. The money came from a foundation. Foundations funded research. The research could begin. The particular financial architecture that MKUltra employed was not, in its basic design, entirely without precedent. Intelligence agencies had used financial intermediaries before. What was somewhat unusual was the scale at which the system was deployed and the range of institutions it eventually reached. Universities across the United States received funds routed through CIA front organizations. Hospitals received them. Research centers. The network was wide enough that no single audit of any single recipient institution would have revealed the pattern. The pattern only became visible when the overall financial structure was examined. which required access to records that the CIA had structured specifically to prevent outsiders from accessing. A check drawn on a philanthropic foundation with a respectable name being deposited at a university bursar's office is a very ordinary transaction. Hundreds of such transactions took place every year at every major research university in the country. A bursar processing such a deposit had no reason to pause over it, no reason to wonder about the organization named on the check, no reason to trace the money back through the layers of institutional structure that sat between the foundation's account and the original source of the funds. The deposit was logged, the account was credited, and the money moved into the university's research budget, the way all the other research money moved. From the bursar's window, it looked like science. From a distance of decades, it looks like something more complicated. The anxiety that produced all of this, the signed memorandum, the front organizations, the network of funded research, the financial architecture carefully designed to be invisible, was genuine. The men who built MKUltra were not, for the most part, cynics constructing a program they privately believed was unnecessary. They were operating within a specific institutional culture at a specific historical moment, a moment at which the possibility that the enemy had access to methods of behavioral control that the United States lacked felt not like paranoia, but like a reasonable inference from available evidence. The evidence was, in retrospect, thinner than it appeared. The filmed confessions of American prisoners of war had explanations that did not require the postulation of exotic pharmacological or psychological techniques. Hunger, exhaustion, isolation, and the ordinary social pressures of captivity could account for a great deal of what the footage showed, but that retrospective clarity was not available in 1953, and the absence of it created a space in which programs like MKUltra could be authorized, funded, and operated for years before any serious institutional scrutiny reached them. The mood of the period is worth sitting with for a moment longer. The early 1950s were years in which the United States was engaged in a kind of anxious self-examination about its own psychological robustness. The Korean War had raised questions in the press, in congressional hearings, in intelligence agency reports about whether American soldiers were as resilient against captivity-based pressure as their counterparts from other nations. Some of this examination was serious, and some of it was less so, but it all contributed to an environment in which the proposition that the government should be conducting covert research into the limits of human behavioral control felt, to the people making that decision, like prudence rather than overreach. The word brainwashing had entered the vocabulary. The question of what to do about it had entered the institutional agenda. The memorandum that Dulles signed in April 1953 was one answer to that question, a formal, authorized, classified answer, signed with an unhurried pen on a mid-April morning in a room that to any outside observer would have looked like an ordinary day of administrative work. It is worth noting what the program was not at the moment of its authorization. It was not yet the network of universities and hospitals and safe houses that it eventually became. It was not yet the catalog of sub-projects, numbered, funded, distributed across the country, that congressional investigators would eventually find traces of in the financial records that survived. At the moment Dulles signed the memorandum, MKUltra was a classified designation, a budget allocation, and a mandate to investigate, covertly and at whatever scale seemed necessary, the possibility of controlling human behavior through chemical, biological, and psychological means. What that mandate would produce over the following 2 decades was not yet determined. It was still a document. It was still ink drying on a page in a government office on an April morning. The full reach of it was still in that moment a matter of future decisions by people who had not yet made them. Project Arctic Choke, the program that MKUltra absorbed, had itself been the product of a similar process of institutional reasoning. Its origins lay in Bluebird, established in 1950 at a moment when the CIA was still a young agency. The National Security Act that created it had been signed only 3 years earlier, in 1947, and was still in the process of defining the scope of what it was authorized and willing to do. Bluebird had been established to investigate whether behavioral control techniques existed that could be useful to the agency, and it had begun exploring that question through methods that included the use of drugs in interrogation settings. By the time Artichoke was reorganized into MKUltra 3 years later, a small network of contractors, consultants, and institutional relationships had already been assembled. MKUltra inherited all of it and began expanding outward from there. The technical services staff, the division of the CIA within which MKUltra was housed, was responsible for the development of technical tools and methods that the agency's operational divisions could use in the field. It was an applied research and development function in the vocabulary of government bureaucracy. Its job was to take problems that operations needed solved and find solutions. The behavioral control research that MKUltra pursued fit, at least from the perspective of the men who authorized it, within this general mandate. If interrogation was a problem, and it was, and it remained one throughout the Cold War period, then a research program aimed at making interrogation more effective was a technical problem amenable to technical methods. This was at least one way of framing it. The framing made the program legible as a normal product of an institutional structure with a normal institutional purpose, which was part of the point of the framing. Edward Hunter's 1951 book had done something important to the public context in which programs like Arctic Choke and MKUltra could be proposed and funded. By giving the concept of behavioral control a memorable name, and by connecting that name to the enemy in a moment of active military conflict, Hunter's reporting had created a political environment in which the proposition that the United States needed to understand and, if possible, develop its own behavioral control capabilities could be advanced without requiring extensive justification. The public was already thinking about brainwashing. The press was already writing about it. Congressional committees were already holding hearings about it. The CIA's interest in the subject was, in one sense, simply the institutional analog of a public anxiety that had already been given a name, a face, and a publishing history. Hunter's own motives are a matter of some historical complexity. He was, by the accounts of people who worked with him, a genuine anti-communist who believed that the threat he was describing was real. He was also, at various points in his career, connected to individuals and organizations with intelligence community ties. Whether his reporting on brainwashing was entirely independent journalistic work, or whether some of it served institutional interests that extended beyond his byline, is a question that historians have not fully resolved. What is clear is the effect. The word he introduced into the American vocabulary became one of the central public justifications for a covert research program that was already underway by the time his book appeared and that continued for more than 2 decades after it. The front organizations that channeled MKUltra's money had their own character as institutional artifacts. They were not shells in the sense of being empty. Some of them had offices, staff, boards of directors drawn from the academic and professional world, and correspondence that looked, on its face, exactly like the correspondence of a functioning private foundation. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, which was one of the primary channels for MKUltra funding, and which was later renamed the Human Ecology Fund, distributed grants across psychology, psychiatry, and anthropology in a way that was indistinguishable from the outside from any other foundation operating in those fields during the same period. A researcher who received a grant from the Human Ecology Fund and who had no reason to investigate the source of the money would have filed it in the category of research funding and moved on. The money was real. The research it paid for was real. The foundation was the part that was not quite what it appeared. This is one of the stranger features of MKUltra as an institutional phenomenon. Much of what it produced was, in a certain narrow sense, genuine scientific research. Some of it was conducted by credentialed scientists at accredited institutions using the standard methods of mid-century behavioral science. The research was flawed in many cases. Its ethical foundations were in some cases entirely absent. Its methodology in others was designed to serve operational conclusions rather than scientific ones, but it existed in a form that was recognizable as research. Papers were written, data was collected, findings were reported. The research sat in a scientific context that gave it an appearance of legitimacy, at least to those who encountered it without knowing the circumstances under which it was conducted. The checks that moved from CIA front organization accounts through the postal system toward university bursars' offices were doing a specific kind of work. They were creating, one deposit at a time, a distributed network of research activity that was connected to a central purpose, the investigation of behavioral control, but that appeared at each individual node as nothing more than ordinary funded science. A psychology department at one institution received a grant to study stress responses. A pharmacology department at another received funding to investigate the behavioral effects of certain compounds. A psychiatry department at a third received support for research into new therapeutic techniques. Each of these relationships was local and legible. It was only from above, at the level of the program that was funding all of them, that the pattern was visible. The postal system through which those checks traveled was a very ordinary piece of infrastructure. Envelopes moved from New York offices to university mailrooms in the ordinary course of whatever day they were sent. A mail clerk sorting the morning delivery at a university administration building would have put the envelope from the Human Ecology Fund in the appropriate pile without a second glance. There was nothing unusual about its weight, its postage, or the return address printed on it. The money inside, expressed as a figure on a check drawn against a foundation account, would have been processed by the bursar's office as research funding, because research funding was what it looked like and what it was, even if the source of it was something that no one in the bursar's office would have recognized from the letterhead. This is how MKUltra spread outward from the single signed page of April 13th, 1953, not through dramatic channels, not through anything that would have been visible from the street, but through the ordinary infrastructure of academic funding, envelopes in mailrooms, checks in bursars' offices, grant letters in the correspondence files of department chairs. The program's financial architecture was designed to use this ordinariness as cover, to make each transaction look exactly like what ordinary transactions in the same channel looked like, so that the overall pattern would be visible only from a vantage point that no single institution in the network could occupy. Alan Dulles had signed the memorandum. The technical services staff had received its authorization. The front organizations were in place, their New York offices equipped with the apparatus of a functioning foundation, their grant letters ready to be drafted and sent. Somewhere in a records room within the CIA, a filing cabinet held folders, marked with names that had been chosen precisely because they meant nothing: Bluebird, Artichoke, and beside them newly labeled the folders that would accumulate under MKUltra's designation over the years to come. The morning of April 13th, 1953 had been an ordinary morning in Washington. The pen had moved, the signature had dried, and somewhere in the postal system, in the days and weeks that followed, envelopes with Foundation return addresses had begun making their way toward universities and hospitals in cities across the country, their contents unremarkable, their origins carefully arranged to resist examination. The program they represented still in its early motion, still in the process of becoming whatever it would eventually be. The checks arrived, they were deposited, the research began. The program's quiet institutional reach spread outward from a single signed page, the way all such programs do, not all at once, not visibly, but one transaction at a time, each of them ordinary looking, each of them part of a pattern that would take decades to see in full. A manila folder sits on a desk in a government records room, sometime in the mid-1950s, its cover stamped with a number in black ink. The number is not a name. It carries no indication of what the folder holds, no label that would have meant anything to a passing administrator, nothing that would cause a person to stop and look twice. Inside, the pages are typed in the neutral, even-handed language of a laboratory log. Drug names, dosage figures, observation notes, set down in the same formatting that any pharmaceutical study of the era might have used. The folder is one of many. It sits beside others with their own numbers, and each of those numbers represents a separately funded line of research, authorized, budgeted, and recorded with the calm bureaucratic thoroughness of an institution that kept meticulous track of what it spent its money on. The program that generated these folders ran what congressional investigators eventually counted as more than 150 distinct subprojects, each with its own funding line, its own contracted researchers, and its own specific area of inquiry. Some of those subprojects lasted only months. Others ran for years, branching into adjacent questions and generating follow-up studies that were assigned their own numbers in turn. Taken together, they represent one of the widest-ranging covert research programs a Western government has ever conducted into the question of what substances and conditions can alter the way a human mind works, what it perceives, what it remembers, and what it is willing to say. The first and most extensively documented area of that research centered on a compound that had been synthesized in a Swiss laboratory in 1938 by a chemist named Albert Hofmann, who discovered its psychoactive properties accidentally in April of 1943 when a small amount made contact with his fingertips during routine laboratory handling. Lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, entered CIA interest in the early 1950s through reports that the Soviet Union might be acquiring the global supply of the substance from its Swiss manufacturer. The concern was not that the drug was inherently valuable, but that a competitor intelligence service might already be using it in ways that were not yet understood. The reasoning that followed was the reasoning of the arms race applied to chemistry. If an adversary might have something, the correct response was to find out what it did before they had the opportunity to use it first. What the agency's researchers were looking for in those early subprojects was a reliable truth serum. The idea was not new. Sodium pentothal had been used for decades in interrogation contexts under the name truth serum, though the evidence that it reliably produced truthful disclosure was always weak. LSD seemed, to the researchers who first studied it, like a more powerful candidate. At very low doses, it appeared to produce a loosening of habitual mental organization, a softening of the ordinary resistance that subjects brought to questioning, a kind of permeability that interrogators might be able to exploit. These were impressions. The formal evidence for them was never established. The subprojects that tested LSD as a truth serum produced results that were, in the clinical language of the reports, inconsistent. What the drug reliably did was alter perception and cognition in ways that were difficult to predict and impossible to control, which made its subjects unreliable as sources of anything, truthful or otherwise, and which made the researchers who administered it very busy writing up results that did not confirm the hypothesis they had been funded to test. Among the populations to whom LSD was covertly administered across these subprojects were military personnel, hospital patients, federal prisoners, and people who had no connection to any institution at all, ordinary civilians encountered in circumstances that gave researchers access to them without their knowledge or agreement. The word covertly in this context means that the people who received the substance were not told they were receiving it. They were given it in their food or water, or administered it intravenously under a false description of what was being injected. The logic offered internally for this approach was that informed subjects would behave differently than uninformed ones, producing experimental results that did not reflect the drug's true effect on an unwitting target, which was the operationally relevant condition. The logic is coherent as far as it goes. What it bypasses is the question of consent, which the subproject reports do not address, because it was not in those rooms at that time the question being asked. The second major area of research ran almost concurrently with the LSD investigations and concerned something more fundamental: the question of what happens to the human mind when the ordinary stream of sensory information is interrupted. At McGill University in Montreal, in the early 1950s, a psychologist named Donald Hebb was conducting what he described as voluntary experiments into the effects of severely reduced sensory input. His subjects were paid student volunteers who agreed to spend extended periods lying on narrow beds in small, lightly soundproofed rooms, wearing translucent plastic goggles that admitted diffuse light but prevented any organized visual perception, and cardboard cuffs over their lower arms and hands that reduced tactile information to near nothing. The continuous background noise in the rooms was not silence, but a steady, undifferentiated sound, something between air and static that occupied the frequency range of ordinary conversation and filled the space in a way that rendered it perceptually neutral. The rooms at McGill were not uncomfortable in any immediately physical sense. The beds were ordinary, the goggles were not painful, the cuffs were loose, the temperature was regulated. What the environment removed was not comfort but pattern, the continuous, mostly unnoticed stream of specific information that the mind uses to maintain its ordinary sense of what is happening and where it is happening. Within hours, in many cases, subjects began to experience perceptual disturbances. Geometric patterns appeared behind the translucent goggles. Sounds that were not present became audible. Organized hallucinations developed. Structured scenes, figures, narratives, which the subjects could observe but could not control and had not invited. When asked to perform simple cognitive tasks, they found their capacity to concentrate had deteriorated noticeably. When the experiments ended and the goggles and cuffs were removed, the return to ordinary perception was itself disorienting in ways the subjects had not anticipated. Hebb's published findings attracted attention far beyond the academic psychology community. The CIA researchers who read them and they read them attentively, were interested not in the perceptual curiosities the experiments had produced, but in the practical implications of the deterioration in cognitive function and resistance to suggestion that appeared to accompany extended isolation. If a subject whose sensory environment had been systematically reduced was also a subject whose capacity for organized resistance had been correspondingly reduced, then sensory deprivation was potentially a tool for making human beings more available to the influence of whoever was managing their environment. The research that followed, funded through front organizations and conducted at a range of institutions, examined this hypothesis with the same methodical curiosity that the LSD subprojects had brought to theirs, which is to say, with genuine scientific rigor applied to an application that the published literature on sensory deprivation had not addressed. A third area of inquiry ran through MKUltra's documentation with a quality that is harder to characterize cleanly because the claims made within it have always been more difficult to verify against standard scientific frameworks than the drug and sensory deprivation findings. The hypnosis subprojects, and there were several, investigated the question of whether a person placed in a hypnotic state could be directed to carry out actions they would not carry out in ordinary waking life, and whether the memory of having been hypnotized and of what had occurred during the session could be selectively removed. The researchers involved were not fringe practitioners. Several held academic positions. The methodology they applied was the methodology of mid-century experimental psychology, and their reports are written in the same measured institutional language as the rest of the program's documentation. What the hypnosis subprojects were trying to establish, at their most ambitious, was a set of conditions under which a human subject could be given an instruction, act on that instruction, and then have no retrievable memory of having received or acted on it. The operational application was clear enough. An asset who carried out a task and genuinely did not know they had done so was an asset who could not, under questioning, reveal having done it. The findings were, again, inconsistent. What hypnosis reliably produced in the research literature was a heightened responsiveness to suggestion in subjects who were already susceptible to it, and who were operating in controlled conditions with a cooperative relationship to the hypnotist. What it did not produce under controlled examination was a reliable mechanism for the implantation of false memories that would hold under interrogation, or for the direction of behavior in subjects who were resistant to it in their ordinary waking state. The program's researchers noted these limitations in their reports. The research continued. Pharmacological investigation across the program extended well beyond LSD into a range of substances whose effects were examined both individually and in combination. Mescaline, which had a longer research history than LSD, and whose effects were better characterized in the existing literature, was administered to subjects in several subprojects, alongside attempts to document its specific effect on the capacity to resist questioning. The barbiturate family, particularly sodium pentothal, which had been marketed commercially as a general anesthetic and had already accumulated the folk reputation of a truth serum from its wartime use, was examined in controlled settings with attention to the specific question of whether a subject under its influence could produce reliable factual information, or whether the drug's sedative properties merely created an impression of disclosure without the substance of it. The evidence for the latter was considerably stronger than the evidence for the former. Scopolamine, a compound derived from plants of the nightshade family and used clinically as an anti-nausea medication and a pre-anesthetic agent, had its own history as a proposed truth serum reaching back to the 1920s. When a Texas obstetrician named Robert House had advocated for its interrogation use after observing that patients in the state of reduced consciousness it produced seemed to respond to questions without their ordinary social caution. The CIA researchers approached scopolamine with the same hypothesis their predecessors had applied, that a state of reduced voluntary control might be a state of increased involuntary disclosure. The findings reviewed across the subproject reports suggested that scopolamine did produce a generalized reduction in mental organization and social resistance, but that it also produced such significant confusion and perceptual disturbance that the information obtained from subjects under its influence was of uncertain reliability. The drug made people more willing to talk. It did not reliably make them more accurate. Amphetamines occupied a different position in the pharmacological catalog because their effect was in one sense opposite to the sedative and disorienting compounds. They produced alertness, accelerated cognition, and in higher doses, a pressured and expansive verbal output that had its own potential interrogation applications. A subject who was encouraged to keep talking under amphetamine stimulation might talk past the boundaries of what they had intended to disclose, producing information not through sedation-induced loosening, but through pharmacologically assisted inability to stop. The subproject reports that addressed amphetamines were interested in this particular dynamic, what? Because, and also in the question of whether combining stimulants with sedatives or disorienting agents might produce a state that was both verbally accessible and cognitively disrupted, a state that would yield disclosure without yielding the subject's capacity to organize a false account. The combinations tested were numerous, the results were variable, the research was thorough. Beyond the compounds already noted, the program's pharmacological investigations also extended to heroin and other opiates, examined in part for their potential use in inducing states of dependency that might make a subject's long-term behavior available to management through the controlled supply or withdrawal of the drug. This was a different operational hypothesis from the truth serum model, less concerned with immediate disclosure during interrogation than with the longer-term question of whether a human being's decisions and movements could be shaped over weeks and months by the pharmacological management of their needs. The research into dependency as a mechanism of behavioral control sits somewhat apart from the rest of the pharmacological catalog, not because it was less carefully conducted, but because the operational logic it served was more patient, more interested in the slow arc of influence than in the quick result of a single session. The electroconvulsive therapy investigations occupied a different register from the pharmacological work, both in their methodology and in what they were examining. Electroconvulsive therapy as a clinical tool had been in use since the late 1930s, when two Italian physicians, Ugo Celletti and Lucio Bini, had developed a device capable of inducing a controlled seizure through electrical stimulation of the brain, and had observed that for certain severely depressed patients, the post-ictal state that followed the seizure carried a lasting improvement in mood. The technique was standard by the early 1950s in psychiatric institutions across North America and Europe. It was administered under anesthesia at frequencies determined by clinical guidelines and monitored carefully for the memory disruption that it was known to produce as a side effect. What the MKUltra connected research conducted at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal investigated was not ECT at its clinical frequencies, but ECT at frequencies that exceeded clinical standards substantially, sometimes many times over. The question being examined was not therapeutic. It concerned whether the memory disruption associated with ECT, if administered at sufficient intensity and duration, could be made total, whether it was possible through the systematic and repeated application of electroconvulsive stimulation to eliminate from a subject's mind not only recent events, but the deep accumulated structure of personal history, habit, language, and acquired behavior. The researchers who designed these protocols had a specific term for what they were attempting. They called it depatterning, and what they believed they were doing was removing the existing pattern of a personality so that something new might be established in its place. Whether the something new was beneficial to the patient was in the theoretical framework they were working from, a matter to be addressed after the removal was complete. The patients admitted to those wards had come, in most cases, seeking treatment for depression, anxiety, or other conditions that fell well within the ordinary range of mid-century psychiatric presentation. They had not come seeking to have their memories removed. Sensory deprivation, as it was applied in the MKUltra framework, took the Miguel findings into a longer and more intensive register. Hebb's original volunteers had spent hours in the reduced stimulus environment. The protocols that developed from his work extended isolation considerably further and combined sensory reduction with pharmacological intervention, sleep-inducing drugs administered to keep subjects in a condition of extended unconsciousness within an environment that was simultaneously eliminating ordinary perceptual input. The combination of drug-induced sleep and sensory deprivation created a state of prolonged withdrawal from ordinary experience, whose effect on cognitive and personality organization was studied in the same methodical way the other sub-projects studied their specific variables. Subjects who had been maintained in these conditions for extended periods emerged with significant disorientation and, in documented cases, with losses of memory and function that the clinicians managing their care found difficult to account for within the standard frameworks of psychiatric recovery. The institutional setting in which much of this work took place was the hospital ward, not a covert facility, not a purpose-built research installation, but the ordinary environment of clinical care, with its nursing staff and meal times and the ordinary rhythms of a medical institution. This setting was part of the research design, not incidental to it. A subject who was a patient in a recognized medical institution was a subject whose behavior was managed by the institution, whose access to outside contact was controlled by clinical protocols, and whose experience of what was happening to them was shaped by the authority differential between patient and physician. The ward was a controlled environment, in a sense that a research facility built specifically for the purpose would not have been, because its controls were already in place, already normalized, already accepted as the ordinary conditions of care. Hypnosis research across the later sub-projects moved into territory that the earlier investigations had not fully explored. The question of what could be introduced into a hypnotic subject's memory, rather than merely what could be removed from it. The implantation of false memories that would remain stable under subsequent examination was a hypothesis that had significant operational appeal. A subject who believed, with conviction, that they had been somewhere they had not been, or that they had experienced something that had not happened, was a subject whose testimony could be shaped in advance. The research into this question was careful, and the findings were mixed. What hypnosis could reliably produce was an increased willingness in susceptible subjects to accept suggested versions of events as memories. What it could not reliably produce was the deep, structurally embedded false memory that would remain stable under the kind of questioning a professional interrogator would apply. The difference between the two was significant. The research continued regardless. The sub-project reports that documented all of this work share a characteristic that is worth dwelling on. the neutrality of their tone. The language is the language of mid-century experimental science, the passive voice, the clinical term, the statistical qualifier, the careful hedge. The subject reported, the report's note, or the observed effect was consistent with, or the data suggest, within the limits of the study design. It is not a language designed to conceal. It is the language of researchers who understood their work as scientific, who were applying the methodological standards of their fields, and who were writing for an audience that would evaluate what they had done against those standards, rather than against a different set of questions about what the work was for and who was bearing its cost. That cost was distributed unevenly across the populations who participated in these sub-projects, and the distribution followed a pattern that reflects the institutional access the program's researchers had to different groups of people. Military personnel were accessible through the authority structures of the armed services. Hospital patients were accessible through the authority structures of clinical care. Prison populations were accessible through the authority structures of the correctional system. Civilians encountered in the specific operational context of the safe houses were accessible through the circumstances of those encounters. The one group that was not accessible in any of these ways, the group that would have been most relevant to the actual operational question of how these techniques might be used against trained intelligence officers from adversary services, was precisely the group that was never included in the research. The population studied were those who could be reached. The population that mattered to the original hypothesis was the one that could not be. This gap between the research populations and the operationally relevant population appears in the program's internal assessments without particular emphasis. The analysts who wrote evaluation reports on the pharmacological sub-projects noted that the findings, gathered largely from civilian volunteers, prisoners, and clinical patients, might not generalize cleanly to the trained operative or the hardened resistance subject. They suggested follow-up research. They proposed modified experimental designs. They did not, in any of the surviving documentation, recommend that the research stop because its subjects and its intended application were so far apart that the data it was generating could not bridge the distance. The research had momentum, and institutions with operational budgets and contractor relationships and accumulated experimental programs have a specific relationship to momentum it carries forward. Across the full sweep of the more than 150 documented sub-projects, the range of research methods is wide enough that it resists easy summary. There were sub-projects that examined the behavioral effects of extreme fatigue, and others that looked at the relationship between long-distance isolation and susceptibility to suggestion. There were sub-projects that investigated the effects of specific combinations of confinement and pharmacological intervention on a subject's long-term capacity for independent decision-making. There were sub-projects that studied the baseline tolerance for discomfort and perceptual distortion that human beings carry before their ordinary cognitive function begins to deteriorate, and others that looked for the specific thresholds at which that deterioration became significant and lasting rather than temporary and reversible. Each of these lines of inquiry was funded, staffed, documented, and evaluated. Each produced reports that were filed in the folders with their black stamped numbers. Each was reviewed by program administrators who assessed whether the findings were promising enough to warrant continued investment, or whether the sub-project should be concluded and its remaining funds reallocated. The administrative machinery of the program was careful and attentive. It processed a great deal of information over 2 decades, and it did so with the systematic thoroughness of an institution that understood itself as engaged in serious scientific work on behalf of a serious national security mission. The drug scopolamine, to return to it for a moment, had been tested as a truth serum for so long before MKUltra took it up that the research program's investigators were in some sense working at the far end of a conversation that had been running for 30 years. What they added to that conversation was methodological rigor and a more specific operational framing, not the general question of whether the drug loosens speech, but the narrower question of whether the information it produced from a prepared and resistant subject could be relied upon as accurate. That narrower question had not been answered satisfactorily by the earlier literature. The MKUltra sub-projects did not answer it satisfactorily either, though they addressed it more systematically than anything that had come before. LSD's trajectory through the program follows a similar arc, beginning with the narrow operational hypothesis of the truth serum, widening as the findings accumulated into a broader examination of what the compound did to cognition, perception, and behavior across a range of doses and subjects, and eventually producing a body of research that was extensive enough to constitute one of the most detailed pharmacological profiles of the drug produced anywhere in the world during the 1950s. That profile was classified. It sat in manila folders in a government records facility rather than in the published scientific literature. The independent researchers who were building their own picture of LSD's effects in the same period were working from a narrower data set and reaching conclusions that the program's researchers had in some cases reached and documented years earlier. The two bodies of knowledge ran parallel to each other, the classified one invisible to the public one, for the full duration of the program. The white noise used in the sensory deprivation protocols, continuous, undifferentiated, carefully calibrated to the frequency range that would most effectively prevent the brain from finding pattern in the sound environment, was generated by ordinary electronic equipment of the kind available in any research institution of the era. The translucent goggles were made of materials available in any laboratory supply catalog. The cardboard cuffs were cardboard. There was nothing about the physical technology of sensory deprivation that was exotic or specialized, which was part of what made the technique appealing from a logistical standpoint. It required no special equipment, no controlled substances, no pharmaceutical supply chains. It required only a room, a few ordinary materials, and time. Mescaline, for its part, had been used ceremonially by indigenous peoples in the Americas for centuries before it was isolated as a chemical compound by German pharmacologist Arthur Hefter in 1897. By the time the MKUltra researchers were examining it in their sub-project reports, it had been the subject of European and American scientific interest for more than 50 years and had an extensive anecdotal literature of personal accounts, including Aldous Huxley's well-known 1954 essay. The CIA's interest in mescaline was specifically pharmacological and interrogation-oriented. They were not interested in Huxley's account of expanded perception, but in whether the compound's tendency to dissolve ordinary cognitive structure made it useful for extracting information from a subject who was trying not to provide it. The answer the sub-project data pointed toward was again not strongly affirmative. The typed sub-project list that investigators assembled from the surviving documentation runs to more than 150 entries. Some of those entries cover only a page or two of records, brief experiments, or theoretical studies that did not generate substantial field data. Others extend across dozens of pages of reports, logs, and assessments, their internal histories complex enough to constitute research programs in their own right. The entries are numbered sequentially, though the numbering does not correspond perfectly to the chronological order in which the sub-projects were initiated, and gaps in the numbering suggest either that some programs were assigned numbers and then not fully activated, or that the destruction of records in 1973 removed some entries from the surviving list without removing the numbers that had been assigned to them. What the numbered list represents, held at the distance that a late-hour reading of old documents provides, is something quieter than the specific contents of any individual folder. It represents the administrative commitment to the program over 2 decades, the ongoing organizational decision that this research mattered, that it warranted funding, that the questions it was examining were important enough to justify the institutional infrastructure required to carry it forward. Organizations make those decisions continuously and routinely. Most of them do not produce documentation as unusual as this one, but the mechanism by which the decision was made and renewed and sustained is the same mechanism by which any large institution sustains a long-running program of work. The folders accumulated in the normal way. The numbers ran forward in the normal way. The research continued, and the paperwork followed it, and the paperwork sat in its room, waiting, the way that paperwork does. The sub-project list, its entries running past 150 toward numbers that the surviving documentation does not fully account for, sits now in archives and reading rooms where researchers continue to work through it on ordinary afternoons. Each number represents a separately funded line of inquiry. Each folder behind each number represents a specific set of researchers, a specific set of subjects, a specific set of questions that the program's administrators believed were worth the money they cost to pursue. The folders are thinner in some places than they should be, thinner than the research they recorded, because the records facility in Rockville held financial documents, but not all the operational reports that would have given those documents their full context. What survived is significant. What was lost was more significant still, and the list of numbers, with its gaps and its surviving pages and its neutral black stamps, rests where it has come to rest, spread across reading room tables under ordinary light, still giving up what it can to anyone who sits down with it. Dr. Ewan Cameron's letterhead was a particular kind of document, the kind that seemed to speak for itself before a single word of the letter beneath it had been read. At the top, in the formal typeface of mid-century institutional correspondence, it named the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University in Montreal. Below that, in slightly smaller text, came the titles: Director of the Institute, Professor of Psychiatry, and, in the years following 1961, the first president of the World Psychiatric Association. Any colleague opening a letter that began with those lines would have recognized, without needing to read further, that the man who had sent it was at or near the top of his profession. Cameron had held that position for years. His reputation was built on decades of published research, on institutional leadership, on the kind of steady accumulation of honors and appointments that marks a career operating well within the recognized boundaries of a discipline. He had served as president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association. He had testified as an expert witness at the Nuremberg Medical Tribunal following the Second World War, helping to establish the ethical standards by which medical experimentation on human beings was to be judged. His name appeared on the editorial boards of journals, in the programs of international conferences, in the acknowledgement sections of other researchers' books. The professional portrait he presented to the world was one of ordered, credentialed scientific seriousness. The Allen Memorial Institute itself occupied Ravenscrag, a stone mansion on the slope of Mount Royal in Montreal, a building that had originally been built in the 1860s as a private home, and that retained, even after its conversion to a psychiatric facility, the proportions and solidity of a structure built to last. The grounds around it were wide and largely quiet. The building's interior had been adapted for clinical use, consulting rooms, wards, laboratory spaces, but the stone walls and the high ceilings and the arched windows that looked out over the city gave the place the atmosphere of an institution with deep roots. Patients arrived. Nothing on the letterhead announced the source of the money behind it. The Human Ecology Fund operated from offices that appear in the records that survive to have been furnished and staffed in the ordinary manner of a small research funding organization. There were filing cabinets, there was correspondence, there was a board with names and titles attached. The administrative infrastructure of a functioning institution had been assembled and was maintained. To a faculty member at a university department who received a grant letter, or to a researcher who attended one of the fund's small conferences, the organization presented a face that was entirely consistent with what it claimed to be. The CIA connection was not visible in the furniture or the letterhead or the academic credentials of the people whose names appeared on the board. It was present only in the financial architecture behind the organization, in the path the money took before it reached the fund's accounts, a path that was designed from the beginning to be difficult to follow. This was, in broad terms, the method. The program that funded Cameron's Montreal research, and a great deal of other research across the country, operated through intermediary organizations, precisely because the alternative, direct government grants from an intelligence agency to university psychiatry departments, would have generated the kind of documentation that the program's architects wanted to avoid. The front organization sat between the source and the recipient and absorbed the visibility that would otherwise have attached to the transaction. The researcher received funding, the institution received overhead. The work proceeded, the letter of acknowledgement went back to a New York address, not to Langley. Sidney Gottlieb arrived at the CIA's technical services staff as a chemist with a doctorate from the California Institute of Technology and a professional history in chemistry that was, by the standards of his discipline, entirely unremarkable. He had studied, he had published. He had developed the kind of specialized technical knowledge that made him useful to a government agency with a particular interest in pharmacological questions. He had a stammer and a clubfoot, details that appear in most accounts of his life, not as defining characteristics, but as the kind of peripheral physical facts that biographers note, because they complicate the picture of a man who spent decades at the center of one of the more consequential covert programs of the Cold War era. He kept a small farm in Virginia. He practiced folk dancing. He lived, by most accounts, simply. In 1953, Gottlieb became the operational director of MKUltra, and he remained in that position for 20 years. The program ran across his tenure like a long administrative responsibility, one that required correspondence, budget management, contractor relationships, sub-project oversight, and the steady accumulation of reports and findings from researchers working at institutions across the country. The work was framed, internally, as a chemistry problem of a particular kind. What substances, in what quantities, combined with what conditions, produced what behavioral effects in human subjects. The framing was clinical and technical, written in the language of a discipline that deals in compounds and reactions and measurable outcomes. Gottlieb met with contractors. He reviewed findings. He approved subproject budgets. He worked in an office building in the manner of a mid-level government scientist, managing a complicated research portfolio, which was, in formal terms, exactly what he was. The classified nature of the program was built into its administrative structure from the beginning, which meant that the day-to-day work of running it did not require any visible deviation from the routines of ordinary government science. He attended meetings, he signed documents, he communicated with researchers and contractors through channels that were themselves part of the concealment architecture, front organizations, cutout figures, indirect funding mechanisms. The program existed inside the normal institutional life of the agency without appearing to disturb it. In 1973, Gottlieb retired from the CIA. In the weeks before his retirement, and on the direct orders of CIA Director Richard Helms, he oversaw the transfer of MKUltra's operational files to be destroyed. The records that had accumulated across 20 years of sub-project work, the reports, the correspondence, the financial records kept in the main system, the experimental findings that had been sent back by contractors and researchers were removed and destroyed. Gottlieb later testified before congressional investigators. He answered questions in the measured manner of a former government scientist asked to account for decisions made in a different institutional era. His answers were carefully factual about what he remembered and carefully limited about what he claimed not to. George Hunter White did not work for the CIA in the way that Gottlieb did. White was an officer of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a figure from a different institutional world who was brought into the MKUltra architecture through a contract arrangement. He had a career in federal law enforcement that stretched back to the 1930s. He had worked narcotics cases. He had run informant networks. He knew from professional experience how to operate in the spaces between official procedures, how to arrange a situation that produced a desired outcome without generating the documentation that a formal investigation would require. The operation that White ran under his CIA contract is documented in the records that survived the 1973 destruction order and in his own journals, which he kept and which were examined after his death. He established safe houses in San Francisco and New York. The San Francisco location was an apartment at 225 Chestnut Street in a hilly residential neighborhood on the north side of the city. From the street, the building was a standard residential property in a city full of them. The exterior gave no indication of what had been installed inside. The interior of the Chestnut Street apartment was furnished and decorated to suggest a private residence. Toulouse-Lautrec prints were hung on the walls, warm colors, figures from Parisian cafe life. The kind of art that reads as personal taste rather than professional decision. The furniture was chosen for atmosphere. The impression a visitor would have received, entering through the front door, was of an ordinary private apartment whose occupant had a specific aesthetic sensibility and a comfortable, if modest, way of living. Nothing in the decor was out of place. The Toulouse-Lautrec prints, in particular, were chosen because they produced a specific quality of atmosphere, intimate, slightly European, suggesting a private space rather than an institutional one. The surveillance equipment was installed behind the walls and in the fixtures. One-way mirrors allowed an observer in an adjacent room to watch what was happening in the main living space without being seen, White observed from that position. The operation at Chestnut Street was designed to test the behavioral effects of substances administered to individuals who were unaware they had received them and who had no knowledge that the apartment in which they found themselves was anything other than what it appeared to be. White documented what he observed. The reports went back through the contract chain to the program's operational center. White's journals, examined after his death, contain entries that describe his work in terms that are candid in a way that formal government reports rarely are. He appears to have found the work interesting. He was not a scientist. His professional frame was that of a law enforcement officer, someone accustomed to gathering information about human behavior in conditions of deception, and his records of the San Francisco operation carry the tone of a man noting observations rather than conducting experiments in any formal sense. The institutional distance between White's background and the scientific program he was serving is visible in the way the records describe what happened in that apartment, not in the language of a laboratory log, but in the more anecdotal register of a field officer noting results. The front organizations that made all of this possible were more numerous than any single description of the program tends to convey. The Human Ecology Fund, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, was the largest and the most extensively documented, but it was not the only channel. MKUltra's financial architecture was built on the principle of distribution. The more separate organizations through which money moved, the harder it would be for any single audit to trace the path from the CIA to the eventual recipient. The organizations were real in the sense that they had addresses and correspondence, and in some cases boards. They were not real in the sense that any of their stated purposes described what they actually existed to do. The academics and researchers who served on the boards of some of these organizations present a complicated picture. Some appear to have known, or at least strongly suspected, that the foundation they were associated with had a government intelligence connection. Others appear to have accepted the role in good faith, their names lending credibility to an organization whose actual nature they had no reason to question. The line between these two groups is not always visible in the surviving records. What the records do show is that the presence of legitimate academic names on the letterhead of organizations like the Human Ecology Fund served a specific function in making the funding appear normal to the researchers and institutions that received it. Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute was a beneficiary of this architecture through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The funding he received supported the research he called depatterning and psychic driving, terms he had coined himself, concepts he had developed over years of clinical work and were, from his professional perspective, extensions of a long inquiry into the mechanisms of psychiatric treatment. The CIA's interest in what he was doing was not, from the agency's perspective, primarily therapeutic. The behavioral questions being investigated at the Allen Memorial Institute were of interest to the program's architects because the techniques involved the systematic disruption of existing behavioral patterns, the attempt to substitute new patterns, touched on the same territory as interrogation and behavioral control. The overlap between Cameron's clinical program and the CIA's operational interests was not accidental. The front organization funding had followed that overlap. Cameron's professional standing gave the program something that money alone could not purchase: institutional legitimacy. A research program at a respected psychiatric facility led by the incoming president of the World Psychiatric Association operated within the normal conventions of academic science. It generated publications. It was presented at conferences. The methods were described in academic papers in the language of psychiatric research, with the same formatting and citation apparatus that surrounded any other work published in the same journals. The front organization money sat behind all of this as an invisible substrate, funding the work without appearing in the footnotes. This was the pattern across much of the program's institutional life. The researchers who received funding through the Human Ecology Fund and its related organizations were, in most cases, operating within the professional mainstream of their disciplines. They attended the same conferences, published in the same journals, held appointments at the same universities as researchers whose work had no connection to the CIA. The program had been designed to inhabit that mainstream, to use the credibility and institutional infrastructure of legitimate academic science as the container for research that was being conducted for reasons that had nothing to do with the advancement of any academic discipline. The university departments that received grants from the Human Ecology Fund processed them in the standard way. A faculty member submitted a proposal, a grant arrived, the overhead went to the institution, the research proceeded. The bursar's office recorded the transaction in the normal manner against a foundation name that appeared on the check exactly as it appeared on any other foundation check. The accounting was clean. The paper trail, such as it was, led to a New York address and stopped there. The research reports that were sent back to the fund went into files that were maintained separately from the academic papers that came out of the same work, the classified record and the published record running alongside each other in parallel, sharing a common origin in the same laboratory, describing related but not identical versions of what had been found. Gottlieb managed those parallel records for 20 years. The administrative discipline required to maintain a program of that scope and duration across more than 150 separately funded subprojects, across dozens of institutions, across multiple front organizations, across contracts with figures like White who operated in a different institutional register entirely, was itself a form of organizational achievement. The program did not simply exist. It was maintained, administered, correspondence managed, budget tracked, and kept sufficiently separate from the agency's normal records. Architecture that it would eventually be possible to order its destruction. The technical services staff, which housed MKUltra, was not the only part of the CIA doing work of a sensitive nature in the 1950s and 1960s. The agency was a large organization with multiple divisions conducting a wide range of covert programs. What made MKUltra unusual, even within that context, was the degree to which its activities were conducted outside the agency's own oversight mechanisms, and the degree to which it reached into civilian institutions, hospitals, universities, prisons, that had their own distinct professional cultures and their own usually different understandings of what was being funded and why. The researchers at institutions like McGill did not, for the most part, understand themselves to be part of a CIA program. They understood themselves to be researchers receiving grant funding from a private foundation with an interest in their work. The distinction mattered from a professional and ethical standpoint, even though it made no practical difference to the research that was conducted or to its effects. The architecture of front organizations and indirect funding channels was built precisely to maintain that gap in understanding, to allow the research to proceed under the cover of academic normalcy with the institutional credibility of legitimate science, without requiring the researchers to know what they were working for. Cameron was one of the few figures in the program's history who appears to have been explicitly aware of the CIA connection to at least some of his funding. The evidence for this is indirect but substantial. The nature of the contact between the Human Ecology Fund and the Allen Memorial Institute, the specific research topics that were funded, and documents that emerged in later litigation. Whether Cameron regarded this awareness as consequential and what he understood the agency to be doing with the findings his research generated is not recoverable from the surviving record with any precision. What the record does show is a man of substantial professional standing continuing to pursue a research agenda that he had been developing for years, with funding that arrived through an indirect channel designed not to call attention to itself. The picture that emerges from the institutional landscape of MKUltra is not one of shadowy figures operating entirely outside of normal professional life. It is in many respects the opposite, a program that worked because it was embedded in normal professional life. It is that used the forms and conventions of legitimate academic and medical research as its operating environment, and that depended on the credibility of real institutions and real professional reputations to maintain the invisibility that made it function. The front organizations looked like foundations because they needed to. The researchers looked like researchers because they were. The funding looked like grant money because it arrived on the letterhead of organizations that had been constructed to look exactly like the kind of private foundation that distributed grant money. Gottlieb's office in the Technical Services Staff Building was, by all available accounts, an ordinary government office. It had the furniture of a government office. It had the papers of a government office, correspondence in and out, budget documents, reports from contractors, the administrative residue of a large program under active management. A visitor who did not know what the program was, looking at that office, would have seen the workspace of a government scientist with a complicated research portfolio and a lot of correspondence to manage. The classified nature of what the program was actually doing was not visible in the office furniture or the filing system or the general organizational apparatus of a mid-level government scientific operation. It was visible only in what the files contained, and in 20 years, very few people outside the program's operational circle had reason to open them. The apartment at 225 Chestnut Street was eventually vacated. White's operation in San Francisco did not continue indefinitely. The safe house was closed, the equipment removed, the apartment returned to its status as an ordinary residential unit in a hilly San Francisco neighborhood. The Toulouse-Lautrec prints came down from the walls. The one-way mirrors were taken out. Whatever traces of the operation's physical installation remained were absorbed back into the ordinary material existence of the building. The exterior, which had never suggested anything other than a residential property, continued to suggest exactly that. White's own assessment of his work, recorded in his journals, was frank in a way that formal institutional records rarely permit. He appears to have found the San Francisco years congenial. The work suited his professional temperament. The observation posts behind the one-way mirrors, the documented effects of substances on unsuspecting visitors, the management of an operation that was officially a safe house but functioned as something considerably more elaborate. These were, from his perspective, within the normal range of the field work that his professional life had prepared him for. His journals are part of the small collection of primary sources that survived the 1973 destruction, not because they were preserved by the agency, but because they were personal records that he kept himself and that remained in private hands after his death. The Human Ecology Fund's New York offices continued to operate through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, distributing grants and maintaining correspondence with researchers across the country. The filing cabinets held the records of a functioning organization, applications received, grants awarded, reports submitted by researchers, the ordinary administrative paper of a grant-making body at work. The foundation had a staff. It had a mailing address. It had, in the sense that any institution has such things, a daily routine. Letters arrived and were answered. Grants were processed. The phone was answered in the name of the fund. Behind the filing cabinets and the correspondence and the academic names on the board, the financial architecture was maintained by people who understood exactly what they were administering. The design of that architecture, the selection of front organization names that sounded like private foundations, the recruitment of academics to lend the board's credibility, the routing of funds through multiple intermediary steps before they reached the researchers was a professional accomplishment of a particular kind. It required an understanding of how academic funding worked and what a legitimate foundation looked like, and it required that understanding to be applied with sufficient accuracy that the result would pass scrutiny from the perspective of a recipient institution's grants office. It did pass that scrutiny. For years, the universities that received grants from the Human Ecology Fund processed them without initiating any inquiries that reached the actual source of the funding. The researchers who benefited from those grants published papers, conducted studies, and built academic reputations, in some cases with work that was funded in part by the program. The gap between what the funding appeared to be and what it actually was, between the New York Foundation address and the agency behind it, was maintained by the architecture for as long as the program ran. Cameron's career continued through the 1960s. His published record accumulated further entries. His professional standing remained substantial. The research at the Allen Memorial Institute that had been supported by front organization funding occupied one part of his work, alongside clinical responsibilities and administrative duties, and the correspondence of a man at the center of an international professional network. His Montreal address, printed on letterhead, continued to carry the accumulated weight of the titles and affiliations he had gathered over a long career. The stone building on the slope of Mount Royal continued to receive patients and to house researchers and to function as the institution it had been since its founding. The distance between how these institutions appeared and what was happening within some of their programs is one of the defining features of MKUltra's institutional history, not a distance created by deception alone, but by the ordinary tendency of institutions to present themselves in terms of their stated purposes, and by the ordinary tendency of people within institutions to understand their work in the terms that their professional culture provides. The researchers at universities who received Human Ecology Fund grants understood themselves as researchers. The administrative staff at the fund understood themselves as staff. Cameron understood himself as a psychiatrist, conducting research at the frontier of his discipline. These self-understandings were not simply false. They were real, partial, and shaped by the information that the program's architecture made available to each person within it. What the New York offices of the Human Ecology Fund looked like on an ordinary afternoon is not difficult to reconstruct from the records. There were desks. There was correspondence stacked in the orderly way of a functioning office. There were filing cabinets, whose drawers pulled open revealed the folders of an active grant-making organization, proposals, award letters, interim reports from funded researchers. A person walking in off the street and looking at the room would have seen a modest professional space doing the kind of administrative work that foundations did. The source of the money in the accounts behind the office and the ultimate destination of the reports in those filing cabinets were not visible in the furniture. They were not written on the walls. They existed in a separate layer of institutional reality, connected to the office by financial flows and information channels that passed through the ordinary-looking room without being present in it in any visible form. That was the design. The ordinary appearance of the rooms was not incidental to the program's function. It was central to it. The grant letters that arrived at university departments, the foundation letterhead on the correspondence, the academic names on the board, the New York address on the envelope, all of it was constructed to be exactly as ordinary as it looked, so that no one who received a letter or processed a grant or attended a conference organized by the fund would have any reason to look past the letterhead to what lay behind it. The checks moved through the postal system and arrived at university bursars' offices and research department accounts across the country. They were deposited, they were recorded, they became, in the administrative lives of the institutions that received them, straightforward entries in a funding record, a foundation name, an amount, a grant period, a research purpose stated in the language of the proposal that had been submitted. The research proceeded. The findings were recorded. Some were published. Some were sent back through the front organization channel to the program that had funded them, where they entered a classified record that ran parallel to and largely separate from the academic record the same research was also generating. The two records, the published and the classified, the academic and the operational, continued in parallel for years, both of them sustained by the same underlying funding, organized under the same front organization names, and kept from meeting by the design of the architecture that held them apart. The grant letter and the classified report were, in a sense, two faces of the same transaction, one visible, one not, both real, neither complete without the other, and the filing cabinets in the New York offices held, across years of operation, the correspondence of an organization that had been built to make that division of faces seem to anyone who encountered only one of them entirely unremarkable. Deep Creek Lake sits in the western fold of Maryland, in a part of the state where the land rises into low, rounded hills, and the tree line holds close to the water's edge. In November, the trees are bare. The lake itself is long and irregular, tracing the shape of a valley that was flooded when a dam was built across the Ukiogani River in the 1920s, and on cold evenings the water holds a particular stillness, the kind that belongs to bodies of water surrounded by forest, when the season has already turned and most of the summer visitors are long gone. On the evening of November 19th, 1953, a group of men gathered in a cabin on the shore of that lake. To anyone passing on the road, it would have looked like any other gathering of government employees at a retreat, dinner being prepared, conversation moving around a table, the lights of a rented building holding against the November dark outside. The men were from the CIA. The occasion was a working retreat organized through the technical services staff, and at some point during the evening, without his knowledge and without his consent, one of the men at that gathering received a dose of lysergic acid diethylamide dissolved into a glass of Cointreau. His name was Frank Olson. He was 37 years old that November. A biochemist by training, he had worked for years at the Army's research facility at Fort Detrick in Maryland, at the edge of the area of government science that concerned itself with biological agents and their properties. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, an ordinary professional man, a husband, a father of 3 children, someone who had spent his career inside the institutional world of government research without attracting particular notice in either direction. He did not know, when he drank from that glass, that anything had been added to it. Sidney Gottlieb, who had prepared the dose, waited approximately 20 minutes before informing the men at the retreat that they had been given LSD. The rationale offered, then and in later accounts, was that the agency's behavioral research program required its own personnel to have first-hand experience with the substances being tested so that they could evaluate those substances more accurately. Frank Olson's reaction to what he had unknowingly consumed was not what the exercise had been designed to produce. In the days that followed the retreat, Olson told colleagues he felt something had changed in him. He described a kind of psychological disturbance he could not precisely name. He was given access to a CIA physician and then to a New York psychiatrist named Harold Abramson, who was himself connected to the agency's research programs. Olson traveled to New York for consultations. The plan, as it existed in the final days of November 1953, was that he would receive some form of medical attention and then, in the coming weeks, be admitted somewhere for more sustained care. He was staying at the Hotel Statler on 7th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan on the night of November 27th into the early hours of November 28th. A CIA colleague named Robert Lashbrook was sharing a room with him, room 1018A, on the 10th floor. At some point before dawn, Frank Olson went through the window of that room and fell to the street below. His death was ruled a suicide. His family was told he had died of a fall. The specific circumstances, the drug, the retreat, the agency's involvement in the days leading to his death, were not disclosed to his wife or his children. The classified nature of the project meant that the full account of what had happened to Frank Olson in those final 9 days of his life remained inside the CIA's records rather than reaching the people who had lost him. For more than 2 decades, that was where the account stayed. It was in 1975 that the Olson family first learned that Frank had been given a drug without his knowledge. A government commission investigating CIA activities disclosed the basic fact of the covert LSD administration, and the family received an apology from President Gerald Ford and a financial settlement. What the settlement did not resolve, because the documents available at that time did not resolve it, was the question of what precisely had happened in room 1018A in the early morning hours of November 28th. That question remained open for decades, settled partially and then unsettled again by what came afterward. In 1994, Frank Olson's 3 children, now adults, authorized the exhumation of their father's body. The forensic examination was conducted by Dr. James Starrs, a professor at George Washington University Law School with considerable experience in forensic investigation of historical deaths. Starrs assembled a team that included forensic pathologists and other specialists, and they examined what remained with the methods available to forensic science 4 decades after the original death. What the examination found was a hematoma on the left side of Frank Olson's skull. The injury was consistent, in the assessment of the examining team, with a blunt force impact, something that had struck his head or that his head had been struck against prior to the fall through the window. The 1953 autopsy had not documented this finding. The original investigation had not considered it. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office opened a brief investigation following the publication of Starrs's findings. Witnesses were interviewed. The surviving documentary record was reviewed. After some time, the office closed the case without filing charges, citing insufficient evidence to establish the facts necessary for a prosecution. The investigation ended without resolution. What Starrs's examination had added to the public record was a documented forensic finding, a specific physical detail noted under specific conditions by a team of named professionals, and what the case could not add, at that point, was the chain of evidence that would have allowed anyone to act on it with legal certainty. Frank Olson's family has continued, in the years since, to hold the question open. The documented forensic detail persists in the record. The answer to what it means, in the precise terms a legal proceeding would require, has not been established. Harold Blower was a professional tennis player. He was 34 years old in the autumn of 1952 when he was admitted to the New York State Psychiatric Institute for treatment of depression following the end of his marriage. He was, by the account of his daughter Elizabeth, who was a child at the time, a man whose ordinary life had been interrupted by grief and by the kind of interior difficulty that in that era brought a person to a psychiatric institution for help. The New York State Psychiatric Institute was a legitimate medical facility. Patients admitted There had a reasonable expectation that their treatment would be conducted according to the standards of care that governed the practice of medicine. Harold Blower had that expectation. He had no reason not to. Beginning in November of 1952, Blower received a series of injections as part of what was described to him as a medical study. The substance being injected was a mescaline derivative, a compound designated EA 1298, which had been developed and supplied through an Army contract. The research was being funded by the Army Chemical Corps, whose interest in compounds of this type was not therapeutic. The men administering the injections were not pursuing a treatment for Harold Blower's depression. They were gathering data on how a human subject responded to a chemical agent. He received 4 injections over the course of several weeks. The 4th produced serious adverse effects. The decision was made to proceed with a 5th. On January 8, 1953, Harold Blower received a 5th injection of EA 1298 at a dosage substantially larger than any he had previously received. Within 2 hours, he was dead. The cause of his death was documented internally. The Army knew from the moment it happened what had killed him. The decision made in the aftermath was to suppress that information, to keep it from his family, from the public, and from the legal system that would otherwise have had standing to respond to it. For more than 20 years, Harold Blower's death was officially attributed to causes that did not include the experimental injection that had actually killed him. His daughter Elizabeth spent years pursuing legal accountability for what had been done to her father, eventually bringing a lawsuit that moved through the courts across the 1970s and into the 1980s. The litigation established in the documented record of a legal proceeding the factual sequence of what had happened in January 1953, the injections, the escalating dosage, the Army's knowledge, the suppression. The case eventually resulted in a settlement. The figure was $700,000, paid to Blower's estate. No criminal charges were brought in connection with his death. The documents that recorded what had been known, and when it had been known, and by whom, entered the record of a civil proceeding and remained there. Harold Blower had gone to a psychiatric hospital for help with his depression. He was dead within weeks of his admission from a compound administered without his genuine informed consent, in a dosage that the people administering it had not tested at that level before. That is what the documented record shows. Linda MacDonald arrived at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal in 1963. She was a mother of 5 children. She was admitted for psychiatric care. The kind of admission that in that year at that institution might have seemed like a reasonable step toward addressing whatever difficulty had brought her there. The Allen Memorial Institute was a respected facility. It occupied a large Victorian mansion on the slopes of Mount Royal, and it had the affiliations and the professional staff that established medical institutions possess. Dr. Ewan Cameron, who directed the institute, had been developing a set of experimental techniques he believed could reach beneath the surface of psychiatric illness and address it at a more fundamental level. The theoretical basis for these techniques was his own, and it was not widely shared by his colleagues, but it had not prevented him from applying the techniques to the patients in his care. The CIA had an interest in the research routed through the front organizations that moved money from the agency to researchers without revealing the source. Cameron received that funding, and he continued his work. What Linda MacDonald received in the weeks and months following her admission to the Allen Memorial Institute was not, by any clinical or legal standard that would be applied in retrospect, treatment. She was placed into drug-induced sleep that lasted over the course of her time at the Institute for stretches as long as 86 days. While she was in that sleep state, she received electroconvulsive therapy at intensities and frequencies far outside what any accepted standard of care in that era described as therapeutic. She received, by the accounting that later emerged from medical records and legal proceedings, approximately 100 electroconvulsive therapy sessions over the course of roughly 2 months. When Linda MacDonald left the Allen Memorial Institute, she could not read, she could not cook, she could not drive. She could not recall the adult life she had lived before her admission, not her marriage, not the births of her children, not the years of ordinary experience that make up a person's sense of who they are and where they have been. She was, by the description of those who worked with her in the years that followed, at the beginning of everything. She learned to read again from a primer, the kind used with children. She relearned the ordinary tasks of daily life from the beginning, the way a person does who has had to start over, not from a setback, but from something closer to erasure. She had entered the Institute as a functioning adult. She left it having lost the accumulated record of her own experience. Her case became one of the clearest documented instances of what Cameron's techniques, applied to a person who had come to a hospital seeking help, could produce. It also became one of the cases that eventually formed the basis for legal action brought in Canada against the government that had permitted and partly funded the research. The process of establishing accountability for what had happened to Linda MacDonald and to others like her moved slowly through decades of legal proceedings and official inquiries before settling into the documentary record. The effects she described, the inability to remember, the need to rebuild knowledge and skill from the ground upward, did not fully resolve. They were the lasting condition of a life that had been altered in a way that medical intervention could not subsequently repair. The Allen Memorial Institute treated many patients over the years of Cameron's directorship. Not all of them were subjected to the experimental protocols. Not all who were subjected to them were affected in the same degree or the same way. What the surviving records establish across a range of cases is a pattern, a consistent relationship between the experimental techniques and a specific kind of outcome, documented across individuals who had no connection to one another except that they had come to the same institution seeking medical care. The people who came forward during the congressional hearings of the late 1970s to describe their experiences in MKUltra-related research were, in a number of cases, working from fragmented memory. That fragmentation was itself part of what they were describing. A person whose memory has been significantly disrupted by an experimental procedure encounters a particular difficulty when trying to account for what was done to them. The very record they would draw on to testify about what happened is the record that was damaged. They know something occurred. They hold the aftermath of it in the diminished landscape of what they can still recall. The specific details, the names of the researchers, the dates of the sessions, the documentation that would connect their case to the program that harmed them, those details are often precisely what is gone. Several survivors who appeared before the Senate committee in 1977 described chronic anxiety that had not lifted in the years since their participation or exposure. Some described a persistent inability to form new long-term memories, a condition that had not resolved and that affected ordinary daily life in ways both large and small. Others described cognitive changes, a change in the quality of their thinking, in their ability to hold and organize information that they had not experienced before their involvement with the experiments. For a significant number of people who believed they had been subjected to MKUltra-related research, the path to any form of official acknowledgement was blocked by a practical problem that had nothing to do with the credibility of their accounts. The 1973 destruction of the program's operational files had removed from existence the records that would have established, in a documentarily verifiable way, that a specific individual had participated in a specific subproject. Without those records, the standard of proof required for legal proceedings or formal compensation was very difficult to meet. A person might hold a clear account of what had happened to them, the institution, the procedures, the aftermath, and still find themselves unable to produce the documentation that an official process requires. The financial records that survived the 1973 destruction could establish that money had flowed to specific institutions and specific researchers. They could establish that a particular hospital had received CIA funding through a particular front organization during a particular period of years. What they could generally not establish because they were financial records rather than experimental logs was the link between a specific payment and a specific patient on a specific date. The gap between what survivors knew about their own experience and what the documentary record could confirm for them was one of the lasting consequences of the January 1973 destruction order. It created a class of people who had been affected by the program, but whose connection to it could not be formally established in the terms that official acknowledgement requires. That situation did not resolve with the congressional hearings or with the public exposure of the program's scope and methods. It persisted for many people as a condition of their lives long after the program itself had ended. The Frank Olson family's situation was different from that of most others connected to the program, in that the basic fact of what had happened to their father and husband was acknowledged by the government in 1975. The financial settlement that came with that acknowledgement was one of the first formal acts of official recognition of harm caused by the program. It named a specific person, acknowledged a specific wrong, and attached a specific figure to an act of institutional acknowledgement. The terms were narrow. They addressed the covert administration of LSD and the suffering that followed from it, without resolving the deeper questions about Frank Olson's death that the forensic examination would raise years later. But they represented a concrete institutional gesture made by a government toward a family that this thing had happened and that it had caused harm. Harold Blower's daughter Elizabeth pursued a similar path through different terrain. The lawsuit she brought moved through the court system across years that became a decade, and the settlement it eventually produced came in 1988, 35 years after her father had died in a New York hospital from an injection he had not genuinely consented to receive. The money settled the civil claim. It did not settle the larger questions of how a research program had been permitted to operate within medical institutions in a way that treated patients as material for experiments they knew nothing about. The Canadian government, responding eventually to the documented cases from the Allen Memorial Institute and to the legal pressure brought by survivors and their families, established a compensation program in the late 1980s for individuals who had been subjected to Cameron's experimental techniques. The program was limited in its scope and in the amounts it offered, and not every person who sought compensation through it received it. What it represented, in the structure of what it was an official act of recognition, a government acknowledging in the specific documentary form of a compensation program with named criteria and a structured process that harm had been caused to specific people in specific ways, and that some form of official response was appropriate. That recognition came decades after the harm. It came after the destruction of the files that would have made individual cases easier to document. It came after many of the people who had been most directly responsible for the research had retired or died or moved into the private lives they lived after their government careers ended. It arrived, as formal recognition of harm often does, at considerable distance from the events it was acknowledging. The legal settlements signed in government offices in the 1980s, the pen moving across the signature line of documents that named specific people and specific wrongs and specific figures, were small concrete acts. They were not healing in the sense that they restored what had been taken. They were not justice in the sense that they held anyone criminally responsible. What they were was acknowledgement in the specific formal language that governments use when they put something on paper and sign it, a recognition that something had happened, that it had caused specific harm to specific people, and that the institution on whose behalf the signature was being placed accepted some portion of responsibility for it. The documents themselves, once signed, entered the permanent record. They joined the financial records that had survived the 1973 destruction and the hearing transcripts from the 1977 Senate proceedings and the court filings from Elizabeth Barrett's lawsuit and the forensic reports from the 1994 examination of Frank Olson's remains and the medical records from the Allen Memorial Institute and the testimony of survivors. They added their specific, narrow, legally precise weight to a body of documentation that accumulated across decades, piece by piece, through the efforts of families and lawyers and journalists and investigators who pursued individual threads of a program that had been designed, in part, to leave as few threads as possible. The program had ended, by official account, in 1973. The accounting of what it had done extended across the subsequent decades in the slow documentary form of lawsuits and hearings and exhumations and compensation programs and archival requests. Each of those processes moved through institutions and systems that operate at their own pace, according to their own requirements, and arrive at their conclusions in their own time. The people whose lives were at the center of those processes lived with what had happened to them, while the institutional acknowledgement worked its way toward them through the years. Frank Olson's children were adults raising their own lives when their father's body was exhumed. Linda McDonald spent years learning again the things she had known. Harold Blower's daughter, Elizabeth, was in her 40s when the legal case she had pursued reached its conclusion. The distance between the events and the responses to them was not a gap in anyone's attention. It was the ordinary pace at which institutions move when confronted with what they have done. What the documented record holds across all of it is specific and concrete. Names, dates, institutions, findings, figures. It holds the specific details of individual lives that were altered in specific ways by a specific program, and it holds the specific limited, formal responses that eventually arrived. The record is not complete. The 1973 destruction ensured that, but it is substantial. It exists in archives and courthouses and published accounts. It is available to anyone who sits down with it. The lake at Deep Creek is still there, in the western hills of Maryland, its long irregular shape following the valley that was flooded a century ago. In November, the trees along its shore are bare, and in the evenings the water holds its particular stillness. The cabin where the November 1953 retreat took place no longer stands in its original form. The Hotel Statler in Midtown Manhattan, where Frank Olson died on the morning of November 28th, was subsequently renovated and renamed, its guest rooms reconfigured, and its ledgers from that era long since gone from whatever administrative offices once held them. What persists is the record, the forensic report, the court filings, the congressional testimony, the compensation documents. These move through archives and reading rooms available under their specific filing designations to anyone who requests them. The ink on the settlement documents, signed in government offices in years that are now 3 and 4 decades past, is still legible. The names on those documents are the names of real people. The figures are specific. The harm they acknowledge was concrete, and it was lasting, and the acknowledgement, when it finally arrived, was set down on paper in the formal language of governments that have decided, however belatedly, to put something on record. That record rests now in the quiet of whatever archive holds it, the pages undisturbed, the ink holding the names of the people it concerns preserved in the ordinary, unhurried permanence of a document that has been filed and has remained. In January of 1973, somewhere inside the building on the bank of the Potomac that the agency used for its records management, a directive moved through the ordinary channels of administrative paper. It was not unusual in its format. It carried the standard markings of an internal order, routed through the proper offices, signed by the proper hands. What it set in motion was the transfer of a very large number of folders from active storage to a room from which they would not return. Sidney Gottlieb was present for some portion of what followed. He had spent 20 years inside the program, from the earliest meetings in 1953, when the authorization was still fresh ink on a classified memorandum, through 2 decades of sub-projects, contractors, safe house leases, university grants, and quarterly reports. And now he was the one overseeing the end of it. The files were not burned in any dramatic sense. They were processed, as records are processed, methodically and without ceremony, by people doing a job in a room under fluorescent light. The work took some time. When it was finished, a very large portion of what MKUltra had generated in the way of documentation, the experimental reports, the sub-project correspondence, the field notes from the safe houses and the hospital wards and the university laboratories was gone. Richard Helms, who had issued the destruction order before his departure as CIA director, would later describe it under oath as a routine administrative matter. Congressional investigators, when they eventually had the opportunity to examine both the order and its timing, found that characterization less than fully convincing. Helms was leaving office. The political climate around the agency had shifted considerably from the years in which the program had operated with its unusual latitude. Whatever the reasoning, the result was the same: an enormous documentary record, assembled across 2 decades and more than 150 funded research lines, was reduced to the condition of something that had never existed. That was January 1973. What the order did not account for was a filing error. Somewhere in the months or years before the destruction directive was issued, a quantity of MKUltra-related documents had been routed to a record storage facility in Rockville, Maryland, rather than to the agency's main records management system. The distinction was small in administrative terms: a misfiled transfer, a box or several boxes sent to the wrong location, the kind of minor clerical error that accumulates without consequence in any large institution and is almost never noticed. In this case, it was noticed only later, and only because someone went looking at the time the destruction order was carried out. The administrators who oversaw it did not know that those documents existed. They could not destroy what they could not find, and so approximately 20,000 pages of MKUltra's financial records, grant receipts, contractor payments, budget allocations, the paper trail of how the money had moved between the agency and the foundations and the universities and the hospitals, sat undisturbed in Rockville, while the rest of the program's files were eliminated. They sat there through 1973 and 1974, through seasons changing over the Maryland suburbs, through the ordinary rhythms of a records warehouse, unread and unsuspected. The political environment that would eventually make those documents matter began to shift in December of 1974. Seymour Hersh, a journalist who had spent years investigating the American military and intelligence establishment, published an article on the front page of the New York Times. The article described illegal domestic surveillance operations that the CIA had conducted against American citizens, activities that had been cataloged internally in a collection of documents that would come to be called the Family Jewels. The MKUltra program was not the focus of what Hersh reported in that article, but the reporting created something that had not previously existed in quite that form, a public and congressional appetite for a serious examination of what the agency had been doing in the years when it had operated with very little external oversight. Hersh was working at a typewriter in a workspace that was by any physical description ordinary. The article he finished existed first in typescript, then in the compositing room, then in the press run, then on newsstands and doorsteps across the country on a December morning in 1974. The machinery through which it traveled was entirely standard. The information it contained was not. What the article did, in practical terms, was open a door that had been closed, and the door stayed open long enough for other things to come through it. The Church Committee, convened in the Senate in 1975 under Senator Frank Church of Idaho, began a wide examination of the American intelligence community's activities over the preceding decades. It was a large undertaking, and MKUltra was not the only subject it addressed. But the committee's investigators, working through the documents that were available to them and the testimony they could obtain, began to assemble a picture of the program that the destruction of the records had been intended to prevent. What they could assemble was partial. The operational files were gone. What remained was testimony and the memory of people who had worked inside the program, and a set of financial records that no one yet knew was sitting in a warehouse in Rockville. The discovery of those records came through a separate Freedom of Information Act request in 1977. The request was specific enough, and the responding agency thorough enough in its search that the Rockville documents were located and identified. Their existence was reported to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which by that point was conducting its own focused investigation of CIA activities. The surviving papers were transferred from Rockville to places where they could be examined. 20,000 pages is a great deal of paper. It is also, when measured against 2 decades of classified experimental work conducted across dozens of institutions and hundreds of researchers, a partial record at best, the financial skeleton of a program whose operational flesh had been removed. Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii chaired the Senate hearings that focused specifically on MKUltra in 1977. The room in which those hearings took place was arranged in the standard configuration of a congressional proceeding, the long curved dais where the senators sat, the witness table facing them, the public gallery arranged behind the witnesses, the ordinary equipment of microphones and carafes of water and manila folders spread across the surfaces. CIA Director Stansfield Turner testified before the committee. What he was able to say, based on the surviving documents, was that the program had funded at least 150 separately identified research projects across a network that included universities, hospitals, prisons, and other institutions spread across the country and into Canada. He said it in the measured language of an official testifying before a legislative body, and the committee heard it in the way committees hear testimony, with the reporters present making notes, and the gallery listening, and the formal record accumulating in the stenographer's transcript. Sidney Gottlieb also appeared before investigators during this period. He was by then a retired government scientist, a man who had grown herbs on a farm in Virginia after leaving the agency, a figure who answered questions in the manner of someone accounting for decisions made in a world that no longer existed in quite the same form. The table in front of him held some portion of the surviving documents. His answers were measured. He had, by the account of those who observed the proceedings, the particular quality of someone who believed that what had been done for reasons that made sense at the time, in a specific historical moment, under specific pressures that the present moment did not fully replicate. Whether congressional investigators found that account satisfying is part of the record. Whether it was true is a question the destroyed files might have helped resolve, and they were gone. The journalist John Marks had been watching the congressional investigation with professional interest. Marks had worked in the State Department before turning to journalism, and he had spent time thinking carefully about the American intelligence community and its post-war history. In 1977, following the disclosure of the Rockville documents and the Senate hearings, he filed his own Freedom of Information Act requests with the CIA, targeted specifically at the financial records related to MKUltra that the agency now acknowledged it held. The documents he received back were not the operational files. Those were gone. They were the financial records, the payment receipts, the grant letters, the budget lines, the pass-through payments that had moved between the agency and the front foundations and the contractors and the research institutions across 2 decades. Marks understood that financial records, when read carefully and cross-referenced with other available information, could yield a substantial historical account, even in the absence of the operational documents they described. He was right. The boxes of documents he worked with, spread across a research table under ordinary reading room light, the pages organized into the groups that made sense as he went through them, contained enough information to reconstruct the general shape of how the program had operated, what it had funded, through what channels, across what institutional relationships. The work of going through them was slow. It is the kind of historical labor that proceeds page by page, with the researcher occasionally finding a detail that connects to something else, and occasionally finding a gap where a connection should be, and noting both kinds of finding in the accumulating record of what the documents do and do not reveal. The book that Marks produced from that research was published in 1979. He called it The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, taking his title from the 1962 film that had circulated the popular notion of a mind-controlled political assassin, a fiction that bore an oblique relationship to the actual program, and which had been concerned with more prosaic interrogation and behavior control goals rather than with the production of assassins, but which had nonetheless captured something of the political anxieties that drove the research. The book became the foundational journalistic account of MKUltra, the document that organized the scattered materials into a readable historical narrative, the work that researchers and journalists and subsequent congressional investigators would return to as a primary reference. It remains in print. It is available in libraries. The financial records that form its evidentiary foundation are available through the National Security Archive. The reconstruction that Marks accomplished with what was left is the clearest record that exists of a program that tried to leave no record at all. The broader question of what the destruction of records means for historical understanding is one that archivists and historians have spent time examining in relation to MKUltra specifically. When operational files are destroyed, what remains is the outline. The financial records describe how money moved. They do not describe what happened in the rooms where the money was spent. They name institutions and contractors and grant recipients, They do not name the individual subjects on whom procedures were performed, or describe in detail what those procedures involved, or record the observations that researchers made about their effects. The operational files would have contained those things. They are gone, and their absence shapes every account of the program that has been written since January 1973, including this one. The Canadian government's response to the Montreal dimension of the program's history took a distinct form. The experiments conducted at the Allen Memorial Institute under Doctors Hu and Cameron's direction had involved Canadian patients, funded in part by American money channeled through front organizations in a Canadian hospital affiliated with a Canadian university. When the program's history became public knowledge, the Canadian government undertook its own inquiry. The findings were sufficient to produce a compensation program for surviving patients and their families, and administrative acknowledgement in monetary terms that something had occurred which warranted official recognition. Linda MacDonald, who had entered the Institute in 1963 as a functioning adult and emerged from treatment unable to perform the basic tasks of daily life, was among those whose cases formed part of the record that Canadian investigators examined. The compensation program did not restore what had been taken. It was a government's way of placing on paper the acknowledgement that something had been taken, and that acknowledgement had its own weight, separate from the sums involved. The American legal proceedings that followed the congressional investigations involved a number of survivors and families who brought civil cases against the government and, in some instances, against the institutions that had participated in the research. Frank Olson's family received a settlement. Harold Blauer's family, through the litigation brought by his daughter Elizabeth Barrett over the circumstances of his death in January of 1953, eventually obtained a measure of legal recognition of what had happened. The Hotel Statler no longer exists under that name. The New York State Psychiatric Institute, where Blauer received the injections that killed him, continues to operate as a psychiatric research facility. The legal proceedings that address these cases required the government to produce documentary evidence of events that had been deliberately concealed for decades, and some of that evidence, once produced, entered the public record through court filings that survive in the ordinary way of court documents, maintained in courthouse archives, accessible to researchers who know where to look. The 1994 forensic examination of Frank Olson's body, carried out after his family had worked for years to obtain the information that had been withheld from them, added a layer of physical evidence to a record that had previously been composed almost entirely of documents. Doctors James Starrs of George Washington University Law School led the examination. The hematoma on the left side of Olson's skull, consistent with blunt force impact occurring before the fall, was documented by the forensic team and reported. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office opened an investigation. It was eventually closed without charges. The forensic finding remains in the record, and the question of what happened in room 1018A of the Hotel Statler in the early morning of November 28, 1953, remains in strictly evidentiary terms unanswered. The record stops there. The physical evidence suggests a complication. The documents that might have clarified it were among those destroyed in January of 1973. There is a category of historical loss that is different from the ordinary incompleteness of the past. When records are lost to flood or fire or the simple decay of organic materials over centuries, the loss is impersonal, a consequence of the physical world asserting itself over the artifacts that human beings have made. When records are destroyed by deliberate order, the loss has a different character, though the practical result for the historian is similar. absence where there should be presence, a gap in the documentary record where a gap was intended. MKUltra's operational files belong to that second category. They were not lost, they were removed. The distinction matters to historians, even when the practical consequence, an incomplete record, is the same. What can be known about the program is shaped by the shape of what survived, and the shape of what survived was determined in January of 1973 by people who understood what they were doing. What did survive continues to be worked through. The National Security Archive at George Washington University holds materials related to MKUltra, the CIA's CREST database, through which the agency makes declassified records available for research, contains documents relating to the program. Academic historians, journalists, documentary filmmakers, and independent researchers have spent years working through these materials and producing accounts that extend and refine what John Marks assembled in 1979. Each new document, declassified through Freedom of Information Act requests, has the potential to add a detail or clarify a connection. Most of what those documents add at this point is texture, a confirming detail here, a new name there, a financial figure that matches or extends something in the existing record. The broad outlines of the program are now well established. The fine-grained operational history, what happens specifically in which rooms on which days, is, in many cases, no longer recoverable. The survivors who testified before the 1977 Senate hearings described, in the public and permanent record of a congressional proceeding, effects that had persisted from their participation in MKUltra-related research, the chronic anxiety, the fragmented memory, the persistent difficulty with cognitive tasks that had been present before the experiments but absent after them. Some of those survivors were disadvantaged in their ability to seek legal redress by the very destruction of files that had also disadvantaged historians, without documentary proof of their specific participation. And Wan Yu too, claims were difficult to establish in the administrative terms that legal and compensation proceedings required. The absence of records affected people's lives in practical ways, not only the ability of future researchers to understand what had happened. That is a consequence of the destruction that operates on a different scale from the historical one, smaller, more specific, more personal, and in some cases not fully resolvable. Senator Inouye, who chaired the 1977 hearings, was a man of considerable institutional experience. He had served in the Second World War, losing his right arm in combat in Italy, and had subsequently built a long political career in Hawaii that extended across decades of American political history. When he presided over the MKUltra hearings, he was one of the more experienced legislators in the chamber, and the measured, unhurried quality of the proceedings reflected something of his own bearing. The record of those hearings, the transcripts, the exhibits, the prepared statements, is available in congressional archives. It is the kind of document that repays careful reading, dense with specific information, dry in its official language, and nonetheless capable, in particular passages, of making the scale and character of the program felt in a way that the subsequent historical accounts, for all their narrative clarity, sometimes do not quite replicate. The primary source has its own quality that secondary description cannot entirely recover. Stansfield Turner's tenure as CIA director, which began in early 1977, coincided with the period of maximum public scrutiny of the agency's past activities. Turner had been appointed by President Carter with a mandate that included greater transparency and accountability, and his testimony before the Senate Committee on MKUltra, in which he acknowledged the scope of the surviving documentation and the existence of the 150 sub-projects it described, was the most direct official accounting the program had received from the agency that ran it. Turner later wrote about his experience as director in terms that acknowledged the difficulty of accounting for programs that had operated under different oversight conditions in an earlier era. His account of those difficulties is part of the documentary record of how the American government processed its own institutional history during the late 1970s, a period that produced a number of such accountings across multiple agencies and programs, as the political conditions created space for them. The 20,000 documents that survived because they were misfiled in Rockville represent, in a sense, a different kind of record than the operational files would have been. Financial records are not experimental records. They describe the architecture of funding, not the content of research. What they reveal about MKUltra is its institutional structure, how the money was organized, how the front foundations were used to create distance between the agency and the contractors, how the grants were distributed across the network of universities and hospitals and individual researchers who made up the program's working apparatus. This is genuinely useful information, and it is information that the program's architects specifically tried to make inaccessible. The fact that it survived is a consequence of a filing error, which is to say, a consequence of the ordinary imperfection of large institutions, the gap between how a bureaucratic system is designed to function and how it actually functions when human beings are operating within it. That gap is, in some ways, the most ordinary thing about MKUltra's exposure. The program was built on an unusually systematic effort to prevent accountability. The front organizations, the pass-through payments, the compartmentalization of individual subprojects, and finally, the destruction order itself. What brought it to light was not a single act of courage or whistleblowing or investigative genius, though Seymour Hersh's reporting and John Marks's archival work were both important. What brought it to light was the accumulation of ordinary institutional processes, a misfiled box of documents, a journalist public records request, a congressional committee's standard investigative procedures, a forensic examination, a set of court filings, a series of testimony sessions in a hearing room. Each of these was, in the specific moment of its occurrence, a routine event within a recognized institutional form. The ordinary machinery of public accountability, applied to an effort to avoid it, produced a partial record, partial but legible. The Rockville warehouse where those 20,000 pages waded through the years following the destruction order is a particular kind of place in the history of this program, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite of dramatic. It was a facility designed to hold paper indefinitely in controlled conditions, organized by routing codes, serviced by staff who managed inventory without necessarily knowing its contents. The box or boxes that held the MKUltra financial records sat on their assigned shelves through the seasons of 1973, 1974, 1976 without incident. They were not guarded. They were not sought. They existed in the manner of documents that no one is currently looking for, present, stable, patient, waiting in the ordinary way of paper in the dark. When researchers and investigators eventually worked through those pages, they were doing something that archival research has always required, sitting with incomplete materials and extracting from them the most accurate account they can build. The work is slow. It requires cross-referencing one document against another, noting where the record is clear and where it is ambiguous, identifying what the financial record implies about operational reality without overstating what can actually be established. John Marks spent years on it. The historians who have followed him have spent additional years. The archive continues to be worked through, and documents continue to be declassified on a schedule determined by the ongoing processes of Freedom of Information Act requests and periodic mandatory declassification reviews. Each release adds something. The full picture, given the destruction of 1973, is not available and will not be. There is something to be noted about the persistence of paper itself, the specific physical fact that ink on paper survives under ordinary archival conditions for a very long time. The financial records from the Rockville facility, transferred to proper archival storage after their discovery, are still legible. The congressional hearing transcripts from 1977 are still legible. The court filings from the various civil proceedings are still legible. John Marks's book, published in 1979, from documents he read in 1977, is still in print. The paper record of MKUltra's exposure, the secondary archive built from the fragments of the primary archive that survived, is not at risk in the way the primary archive was. It has been reproduced, cited, digitized, held in multiple places. The exposure of the program generated its own documentary record, and that record, unlike the one it describes, has not been subject to a destruction order. The surviving documents resting in those long rows of archive shelves under the particular quality of light that reading rooms have, a flat, even illumination that does not change with the hour, continue to give up their details to anyone who comes to sit with them. The process is unhurried. There is no urgency to it now. A researcher settles into a chair, signs the access log in the reading room's standard register, and receives a box. Inside the box, the folders hold their pages in the order they were given when they were last organized by archival hands. The pages are slightly stiff, the way old paper is. The ink is clear enough.